She did not scream. She did not spill the coffee. She slid her thumb into her palm and tapped the saucer practiced, a motion so small that the morning shifted around it like a ripple in still water. The gesture could have been a habit, a nervous tic. To him, it was everything. The diner hummed in the thin light between breakfast rush and the noon lull. Vinyl booths cracked under old stories. Chrome fixtures wore fingerprints like medals, and the coffee pot gurgled with a rhythm that matched Sophia Hart's pulse. She kept her movements economy itself. Wipe, pour, smile. 20 years old, apron tied at the waist, a hair elastic looped at the wrist. She knew the regulars, the accountant who ordered eggs at night, the kid who bought newspapers to fold into airplanes by the way their elbows found the table. Her life fit into the margins between orders. She liked it that way. It made danger feel distant. He didn't like distant things. Donovan Concaid sat alone in booth 4, wrists double-wrapped in a wool coat, even though the morning had warmth in it. He ordered black coffee and left the cup when it came only half drunk, watching everything else, as if the room were an instrument and he could read the score. When Sophia tapped the saucer, his eyes flicked up the way a hawk finds a movement in the grass. Not many people used to that signal. He hadn't seen it in 10 years. Not since a night that still tasted like iron. Outside, someone in a gray jacket fitted a rifle up to the diner window, a ghost in a scope. Unnecessary to anyone but the gray-jacketed man and the life he'd chosen to end. The sniper thought the man at booth 4 was the only story worth concluding. He didn't know about the hand inside the diner, or the hand that would intercept fate. The bullet punched through plate glass and missed Donovan by inches, showering the booth with glass like a storm of stars that settled on the chrome tables in little, dangerous glitter. A woman at the counter shouted. Someone else ducked. Sophia moved because she always moved, without thinking, like muscle memory. Her thumb tucked, 2 taps. Donovan's reaction was animal and precise. He pushed across the table, his coat a dark wing in. His hand closed over her wrist for half a beat. A contact that steadied and took measure at once. He smelled expensive tobacco and lemon soap, and the faint metallic temps of possibility. Stay down, he said without shouting. But the words had the authority of an order. She already was down. She slid behind the counter and into the narrow shadow where the coffee machine steamed like a small betrayed world. Her breath came shallow. The gunfire had been close enough to burn sound into her teeth. She felt other things, too. A tingle at the base of her skull. A memory of Soan-jo, maybe teaching her this exact motion on a stoop 2 towns away, a promise made in the hush between trains. She thought of a leather ledger, of a name whispered into a pocket, of an iron key she'd never seen but had dreamed of. These things were cobbled together in memory the way people cobbled together their lives, the essential parts not always in neat rows. Donovan rose and moved with his men like a dark comma in a sentence that was trying not to end. The diner emptied by degrees, leaving the clink of cutlery and the smell of burnt toast. A paramedic eased out a patron with a paper towel at his brow. Someone else called the police. Someone else dialed a number that ended in hush. What did you do? Donovan asked once they were in his car, wind whipping the morning into a staccato of rain that made the city look like a photograph soaked in oil. He was close enough that she could count the slight imperfections in his hands. A nick that bisected the knuckle of his left thumb, a faint scar under the base of his thumb where leather and life had once fought. She swallowed. She didn't lie. How could she? The motion was reflex, older than a conscious decision. I tapped the saucer, she said. Like my father taught me. His eyes found her in the rearview mirror. Your father. She almost laughed at the plainness of the phrase. He said if I ever needed him, I'd tell him. Without words. He used to. She pressed her palm into her lap, like that could hold the memory in place. He used to show me how to make it look like nothing. They didn't talk the rest of the way to his house. The house rose out of the street like a well-cut secret. Donovan called it a mansion the way people called law firm lobbies marble. It was big, but not ostentatious. The kind of place that suggested time, not money. Inside, the staff moved with the kind of ease that comes from years of carefully rehearsed service. Arthur Pendleton, who handled the household's affairs, met them in the foyer. Tall, silvered hair, face like a ledger that had never made a bad entry. He had a way of looking at Sophia that was like someone reading an unfamiliar but important document. "You were lucky," Arthur said. His voice had the precision of someone who logged details for a living. "You could have been." He did not finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Bianca Rossi was the kind of woman who looked carved from the old world, aristocratic, small hands, a voice that suggested money had taught her how to be sharp. She watched Sophia like one reads a ledger entry, with a professional distance that often ripened into scorn. She did not hide her suspicion. Donovan's meant Silvio Moretti? A brute who could have used gentler hobbies, and two others whose names Sophia forgot the minute she heard them circled like slow tides. For the first night she slept in a bed that wasn't a bench she called the good bench in the diner. She felt under observation. It was protection, in the shape of a cage. "Are you going to question me?" Sophia asked when Donovan finally found her alone behind a heavy curtain that smelled faintly of cedar and antiseptic. He sat at the edge of the bed and lit a cigarette with hands that trembled just enough to be human. Smoke braided into the room and the light from the window painted everything in clean, clinical lines. "I need to know who your father is." "I told you. His name is John. No last name." She offered him a half-truth. "Hart?" Donovan's jaw tightened in a way that suggested the name scraped against something. "Hart's a common name." "John Hart is not common," she said. "He saved people. He taught me to keep empty hands." "He saved people? How?" Donovan cut in. He wasn't looking to be dramatic. He wanted facts. He had learned long ago to collect them like coins. She told what she could remember. Little things. A lullaby hummed in a van's back seat. A scar shaped like half a crescent on his wrist. A leather jacket he kept pressed to his chest not for warmth but for reasons she couldn't name. She told him about the iron key he had said was a joke. The ledger he clutched like a Bible in the hazy frames of her earliest memories. She did not know what the ledger had contained. She only knew that her father had once told her to run if anyone ever asked for it. Donovan listened and watched her, while he connected the dots with the kind of swift arithmetic that had kept him alive. He had been a namer of things once. Who you owed, who you trusted, who had the leverage. Names were a currency. Hart, Falcone. He heard echoes in her speech, a tilt of phrase, a particular way she tied words that suggested she had been around names that mattered. "You knew the signal," Donovan said finally. "You used it inside the diner." "That wasn't an accident." "Most people would scream." "Most people don't have a father who taught them how," she said. "I didn't come looking for anything. I was serving eggs." "It follows," he said. "That doesn't make you innocent." He didn't say that categorically, the way a prosecutor would. He spoke like someone who had concluded that the world falls into different categories of danger and she, by virtue of the signal, might be in one of them. He could feel it in the way his men watched her. Suspicion edged with a private calculation that bordered on respect. They put her in a room with a window that looked over the stone courtyard. The first night, she lay awake, counting the water stains on the ceiling, refusing to let sleep soften the edges of the morning. She had wanted to go back to the diner the minute Johnston's coffee cooled. She had wanted to stand behind the counter as if nothing had happened. Now the house hummed with invisible electricity. It was not the kind of safety she had imagined. Arthur checked on her like someone who had made it his business to catalog lives. He brought her dinner with an economy of words. "You look like him," he said once. When the words between them had found a fragile orbit, he pushed the plate away from her and tapped the table twice, then laughed at his own joke. "Like who?" she asked, because a part of her did not want to acknowledge what that comparison suggested. "Someone who left more than coffee stains," Arthur said. He had a way of looking at her that wasn't quite pity and not quite curiosity. "There are photographs, a few things in the archive that don't line up. Your name keeps cropping up in the margins." She didn't understand how someone's life could be present in the margins. Her father's life had always felt like that. Half glimpsed, half removed. She pressed her fingertip into the spot where a little scar had made the skin a moon of lighter shade on her forearm, the kind of mark that pointed back to a night that might have been important. She'd always suspected she had been a child of other people's decisions. The house kept things orderly. Donovan kept things compartmentalized. He assigned people to watch and men whose faces were shorthand for possible threats sat outside her door. Sometimes he came in the late hours. Sometimes he sat by the window, a silhouette against a light that was too much like interrogation. He did not sleep that much. There were advantages to being under his roof. She had hot water that ran more than trickles. She had clothes that were not diner-worn. She had food that did not sweat grease. She had a bathroom that smelled faintly of lemongrass and the memory of a man who had once slept on the other side of a newspaper stand. Those were uncomplicated mercies, and they softened the hard lines of imprisonment a little. On the third night, Donovan brought in a thin file that Arthur had compiled. He set it on the coffee table like a verdict and watched her with a face that tried not to be hungry. The file contained a photograph. The photo was older than counting. It showed a man with a shoulder-broad jaw, hair the color of coal ash, leaning against a wooden fence. He had a crescent-shaped scar on his wrist, the way Sophia's grandfather had told stories of war scars, the way people tell stories of saints. The man in the photograph had the same lean as Sophia when she reached for plate, the same way his hands seemed built to hold things that might break. "This him?" Donovan asked. She looked until her eyes blurred. Her fingers found the musty edges of the paper and trembled. "That's John," she said. "That's him. John Falcone." His voice did not mock. It was a simple, clinical correction that landed like a pebble in a well. He changed his name to Hart for a while. He didn't like being tied to old papers. He tapped the photograph. He left a ledger. People remember that ledger? The word ledger moved through the room like a tide. It wasn't an accusation. It was a pivot. Donovan's shoulders tightened. He had built a life on knowing where names existed and where they were buried. A ledger was not just a book. In his world, it was memory made permanent. A map of favors. A silent ledger of debts and loyalties and betrayals. If the right pages fell open in the wrong hands, cities shifted. Sophia's pulse stuttered. A ledger was not something her father would have mentioned like a recipe. His stories had been folded into love songs and lullabies and cheap pizza. He had never spoken of long accounts with politicians and dead men. But the photograph was a key, turned in a lock. The gesture she had made in the diner had not been an accident. It had been something someone recognized. Something that tethered her to a past she had not understood. She had been a keeper of small things, napkins, orders, people's secrets. She had not known how heavy the things she carried could be. "Where is he now?" she asked. Arthur hesitated. People in rooms of power learned how to make their hesitations mean less than they did. "Missing," he said. "Presumed off the grid." He chose the phrase like a man choosing his words to avoid making new enemies. Donovan's mouth hardened. "Why was someone trying to kill you?" Sophia asked. "I thought they were after him." Donovan looked at her like someone considering the weight of her honesty. "Because you tapped the saucer," he said simply. "Because someone thought you'd lead them to what he left behind. Because there are people who believe the ledger is worth more than blood." She had expected to be angry, to lash out. Instead, something colder set in. Her life had been small because she had chosen it that way. The tiny rhythms of the diner had been a refuge. Now the world had widened like a wound. Fear and fury braided into one. "You could have told me," she said. "You could have told me any of this before you put me under your roof." "Would that have kept you safe?" Donovan asked. "Would that have kept you alive?" She had no good answer to that. The house smelled like old money and safer options. The windows had heavy curtains that blocked the world in ways that could be comforting and also claustrophobic. She liked some things about the way the staff folded towels with exactitude. She hated the idea of being a watched object, a specimen under glass. Days focused into the kind of routine that pretended to be normal. Meals timed, walks in the garden under watchful eyes. The occasional invitation to join Donovan for a glass of scotch that tasted like a risk. He asked questions that were soft enough to be human and sharp enough to be interrogations. He watched her hands when she spoke, and sometimes, if she met his gaze, she could see the man behind the boss. Yet he was forever framed by the fact that men like him had to be absolute. He could not afford tenderness without giving leverage. Sophia found herself looking in mirrors, not to check a stray hair but to see if the face staring back belonged to the girl who washed dishes or someone else entirely. She began to practice the silent signal in the privacy of her palm, like testing a muscle. It felt different, here weighted and charged. No longer just a safety valve, but a message sent to a man who had 1,000 ways to respond. On the 5th night, there was a disruption. A woman with alabaster skin and eyes that could measure and condemn walked into the house with an invitation and an attitude. Bianca Rossi arrived with flowers that looked staged for a photograph and a smile that never quite reached the smile lines around her eyes. She greeted Donovan with the kind of cold warmth that only women raised in the corridors of power mastered, a practiced tilt of the head, a note of interest that was calculation and silk. "She's always been elegant," Bianca said later, loud enough for the servants to hear, for the remark to be a stone tossed into a pond that rippled to the far reaches of the house. "And she looked like a ghost in that diner." Bianca's eyes lingered on Sophia the way a vulture might study a fresh break wind. "Ghosts are good for rallies," she added. "They make people sympathetic." Sophia answered only with a Lukasilos that carried its own weight. She was learning how to speak in ways that were not vocal. People in that house learned quickly. Then the first real fracture happened. A kitchen manling caught with a thumb drive that didn't belong to him. A system stumbling because someone had used the passcode for a plant manager's locker. Arthur's calculations were precise. An inside job, the whisper of betrayal spread like ringlets of smoke. Donovan's jaw set into granite. "You betrayed us," he said to no one in particular. His voice had the ice of someone who had cut a friend off for a reason he couldn't explain. He didn't accuse Sophia, and he didn't exculpate her. He had a list of things people did when they feared for their skin. Lie, betray, barter. He had a levers and pulleys view of loyalty. "We should leave," Sophia suggested. Surprising even herself. "If someone inside this house is working for them?" Donovan's laugh was low and not unkind. "Leave where?" "Anywhere," she said. "Anywhere. It's not your mansion." There was a long quiet, a folding of thought. Donovan had possessions that were not solely material. Arrangements, old feuds, obligations. Leaving would mean bleeding opportunities he had right now. It would mean exposing someone who might need protecting. It would mean admitting he had been wrong. "Not yet," he said. "We fix it here." "Fix how?" "Arrest whoever did it. Call the police. They tried to shoot me inside a diner. That's public. All of this it's half in your hands and half in someone else's. Then we find out which half is rotten," he said. "We tighten down. We stop the bleed." She felt the word bleed like an animal being skinned alive under the surface of his syllable. Not the most comforting imagery. She hated being at the center of policies. She hated that people could speak in metaphors that finally led to someone else's death. Sophia was not powerless in the way that terror often made people powerless. She had learned small deceptions raising herself on the edge of cities. She could hide a note, slip an object from someone's pocket, tell a lie that sat like a comfortable coat until the storm passed. It was not enough. She wanted more than survival. She wanted truth. So she started to look. She made friends with a woman who worked nights stocking the linen closet, a young man who delivered newspapers in the rain. She learned the patterns by watching who came in and who left, who lingered outside the kitchen, and who watched the security monitors like a bored priest. It was not sleuthing exactly, more like gathering breadcrumbs. Each scrap added to a slow picture. Arthur's file had been a window. The people she met were the frames. In the corner of the playroom, under a stack of legal pads, she found a photograph, not in Arthur's file, but tucked among a router manual and an old, unused key. It was a smaller photo than the one they'd shown her. A man, a child, a battered van. The child clutched something metallic. The man had the half-moon scar on his wrist. On the back of the photograph, in ink faded by time and hands, someone had scrawled a line of a lullaby. Beneath that, a looped signature that read Johnny, and a single word she had not heard before. Falcone. Falcone. The name sat in her mouth like a foreign letter. It sounded like a bird and a law and a lineage. Her father had called himself Hart in the mouth of strangers. Falcini belonged to a different tongue. It felt like inheritance and accusation folded in the same breath. She swallowed. She began to connect the ledger in Arthur's file and the photograph under the manuals. She imagined pages stuffed with names and money and promises. If such a book existed, and if it was true that it could unsettle alliances, then silence was not only a safety but an instrument. The more she learned, the more she knew that the signal she'd used at the diner was both lifesaver and the first syllable of a sentence she hadn't finished. Then the house struck back. It happened in the kitchen, which is always the most honest place in any home. Heat and knives and lives reduced to simple acts. A delivery came at noon, and with it, a man who didn't look like he belonged. He moved through the staff like a shadow, a hand in a pocket, eyes that watched too long. The radio in the prep area played a song with twanged sorrow. Someone dropped a stack of pans. Sophia's fingertips tingled. The geometry of the kitchen had changed from predictable to dangerous. He lunged, fast as a river. The knives were out because they were kitchen knives and, mercifully, ordinary. The air smelled of garlic and burned oil and something else metal, the promised suspicion of broken things. Sophia reacted because she always had. She stepped into line with him, and the man misread her for someone else, and that's how the scuffle opened. Glass shattered. Somewhere. A pot skittered across the tile and collected the light like a shallow moon. Hands grabbed shoulders. Voices rose. Sophia had never been trained for this. She had only instincts. A knee into a groin. An arm around a wrist. A shove that sent a man reeling. People who lived close to knives often understood angles. She learned them as geometry. Donovan was there, like a shadow that swallowed light. He moved into the skirmish with a speed that made the air snap. Silvio followed, with a grunt that declared raw force. By the time the fight landed in the one of the attackers moaned on the tile with a face that looked like someone who'd swallowed the wrong truth. The staff clustered, eyes wide as coins. Afterward, as they sat back, ritual tired, in the quiet that follows violence, the house held its breath. Arthur came in with a face, the color of bad margins. There was a breach, he said. Somebody opened a door they shouldn't have. Donovan bristled and something fierce set on him like a mantle. Sophia expected a speech, harsh, clean, effective, but instead she watched him do something she had not expected. He went to her and took her hand in a way that was no longer entirely professional. "You okay?" he asked. She wanted to tell him about the way her wrists ached, as if from new stitches. She wanted to tell him about the small, furious joy of having moved and not been broken. Instead she said, "I am now." It was then that Arthur added a detail that lodged like a splinter. Passcode used. It wasn't brute force. Someone had a key. Internal access. Who would have that access? Donovan asked. Bianca's name seemed to hang in the room like a dropped glass. Bianca had been in the back earlier, Arthur said, for tea. She was talking to the kitchen manager about suppliers. She knows the systems. Her people can move things. Sophia's stomach dropped, as if the floor had shifted beneath her. She had suspected betrayal was out there like a fish in murky water, but seeing the name made the water thicken with reality. Bianca, an instrument that cut quietly, hands polished, but capable. "She wasn't here when it happened," Donovan said. "She left before the scuffle." "But she had motive," Arthur said. "Old family grudges. Pride. Access." Donovan made a fist, then let it unclenched. "Find out who made the call," he said. "Find her. Who gave the access. Tighten home security. No one goes anywhere without an escort." Sophia listened and felt something in her shift. The house had walls and corridors and curtains that seemed to conspire against her. She was learning how to move through them like someone learning a new language. Clumsy and eager. She tasted vengeance in the air like copper. That night, she replayed the diner in her mind until the simple act became mythic. 2 taps. A saucer. A decision that had broken the sphere of her life and summoned men who used the language of debts and names. She had waved a small silent flag, and a continent had moved. The next morning Donovan called her into the library. He did not sit behind the desk as he typically commanded others to do. He sat on the edge of the armchair like a man who had decided, finally, To speak plainly, his expression was a ledger of choices. I could have walked out on you, he said. I could have left you in a hospital, in a thing that makes you forget everything and teaches you to be afraid of your own hands. I didn't. I brought you here because I thought it was better. I thought I knew how to keep you safe. Then why the questions? She asked. Why the files? Because there are things people will kill for, he answered. Because the ledger is a weapon. Because people think if they hold the pages at the light, they'll see the shape of someone else and end them. Because sometimes protection is ownership, and ownership is dangerous. She wanted to spit out a reply that would taste like freedom. I am not some object to be stored in a vault, Donovan. He looked at her like someone who wished hard that he could change the world with the sound of his voice. I know that, he said. But I'm not naive either. People use the word safe when what they mean is contained. And what's the ledger to you? She asked. Is it leverage? Is it just lines scrawled across paper? It is proof, he said. Proof that promises were broken and favors were traded for futures. Proof is the only thing people like us can hold that won't betray us. He paused. If the ledger is real, and if it is out there, it changes everything. She stared at the man in the armchair and imagined herself, years from now, sitting in the same place with the same photograph underlaying her thumb. She thought of her father, and of the way he had taught her to keep her hands open and empty. She had been empty so someone else could fill her with a life that felt safer. She wanted to take back the emptiness and make it a weapon. Then, show me, she said. If you want to trust me, show me what's in that file. Let me see. Let me help. Donovan's gaze sharpened like a blade. They were in a house that taught people to weigh every option, some measured by money, others by blood. Donovan measured by the lives that would be lost if they misplayed their cards. He rose, and for a second there was a softness in him that made the room almost unrecognizable. If we go forward, he said, we do it together. But you should know what that means. What does that mean? It means you will be in the line of fire. It means you may make choices you can't take back. It means you may want to run and you won't be able to. And if you survive, you may have to become something you never thought you could be. She thought of 2 taps, of a small gesture that had folded her life into someone else's calculus. The memory of a lullaby and a key. The photograph with Falcone written on the back in a hand she could not forget. She felt something like resolve, hungry and new. I know, she said. He reached out then and touched her cheek. A contact more human than the rest of their dealings. Good, he said, because there's a war in the margins of this city, and sometimes the margins bleed into the middle. They both knew it wasn't a metaphor anymore. They also both knew that once you step into a war, you can't choose where the bullets will go. You can only choose how you stand. Outside, rain made rivers in the gutters. And somewhere in the house, a phone vibrated with a message that would set the next chain in motion. The ledger's shadow grew longer. The signal she'd given with the saucer had been only the first note in a symphony whose crescendos had not yet been composed. Sophia fell asleep that night with a photograph pressed into her palm and the memory of a lullaby turning over like a key. She had no idea yet that the next step would be betrayal so close it would feel like a family quarrel, nor did she know the cost that would be asked of the people who had protected her. What mattered was this. She had moved from reflex to choice. That small, private gesture had been heard. It had brought men who kept lists of favors, and those lists do not forgive is. When dawn came, she woke with the same determined ache. She had asked to see the ledger, to be part of the truth that Donovan had promised to share. He had agreed. It was, she thought, the first time in her life someone had offered her information as if she were a person and not merely a problem. What she could not yet foresee was how close the traitor would be, and how a single misstep in a kitchen could loosen a thread that unraveled everything. The house kept its secrets well. It kept its betrayals better. Outside, the world kept moving, and lines of men sat in rooms 2 blocks away drawing up names. Sophia dressed and walked into the kitchen that morning, with a tray of croissants and a face that tried to keep an even keel. She arranged the pastries on a plate and set them on the counter, and someone came up behind her with laughter in their voice like the sound of a coin dropped into water. You're too young to be damaged, the voice said. She turned. It was Bianca, smiling like someone who had practiced at being Her perfume was a careful citrus that hid any trace of venom. "You've been through something," Bianca said. "I can see it. It's charming when people survive things." Sophia put one croissant on the tray with hands that were steady now. "Surviving is tedious," she said. "I'm trying to move on." Bianca's smile tightened. "Move on where?" "To the diner. To some life of coffee and cheap counter conversations." "I'm not sure what life I own yet," Sophia said. "But it won't be dictated to me." Bianca's eyes flicked to the photograph pinned in the staff room by the bulletin board. Someone had left it there like a small, unguarded truth. She followed the line of Bianca's glance and felt the air thin. "Curious," Bianca said, "how certain things find their way into the light." Sophia wanted to ask who she was talking to. She wanted to ask why someone in a house that hummed with the bloodlines of the city would throw darts at a woman like her. Instead, she smiled in a way she meant to be polite and left the kitchen. There were more questions, and Donovan had promised answers. On her way back to her room, she paused by the window and watched the city breathe. Cars speckled the streets like dark beetles. Someone had chalked a child's drawing on a stoop. A bus hissed past. Her life had become a series of decisions that always cost something. She thought of her father's hands and the iron key he had said was a joke. She imagined him somewhere, alive or dead, holding secrets like a weathered map. She tapped the inside of her palm, without thinking, then counted 1, 2. The signal was small and private and could still be used for things he and she had not yet named. It had saved a life in a diner. It would, she suspected with a new, careful certitude, be used again. The house held its breath with her. The city's undercurrent kept moving, and men like Donovan waited to see which currents would rise to the surface and reveal the ledger's shape. The first fractures had already begun. In rooms she could not see, names were whispered, favors tallied, and a woman with a name like a bird would decide which winds to ride. Later that afternoon Arthur came to her room with a cup of tea and a face that suggested he had reconciled himself to the idea that secrets were an expense. "You should know," he said quietly, "that not everyone in this house is who they seem." She put down the cup and met his eyes. "I know." "Then be careful," he told her. "Careful with the gestures that saved you. People take notes." They both looked toward the door, as if someone might be listening. The house had ears. The city had teeth. Sophia understood she had been placed deliberately at the center of a small, escalating geometry of power. Whether the center would hold depended on the hands that held the ledger and the hands that trusted her signal. She folded her hands across the photograph and thought of keys and lullabies and a name carved in faded ink. She had changed. She had stopped being the anonymous server behind the counter. She had begun to be someone who could make choices. Outside, a car drove by with tinted windows. A man with a small speaker on his shoulder was speaking in a language she didn't know. The city had ways of telling you it was not finished with you. Inside, Donovan stood in the study with his own constellation of men, and he made a call to somebody whose voice carried the weight of weather. "Find who's behind the code," he said. Across the house, someone took a breath, and somewhere else a decision was being made that would tilt the scale. Sophia folded the photograph into the soft line of her palm and felt the old lullaby move like a key behind her sternum. Two taps, small, decisive, sat in her muscles like a renewed promise. It was a gesture that had saved a man and now, quietly, would set them all on the ledge of a war they could not yet name. If you love edge-of-your-seat crime stories, like and subscribe. Sophia's only going up from here. They left in the gray hours, when the city still smelled of rain and the streets were thin with people who moved like ghosts. Donovan's men folded the house into itself with the practiced slowness of people erasing footprints. Arthur's file was tucked into a case that looked like a portfolio, as if what it contained were only contracts and schedules. Sophia kept the photograph folded in her palm, a private talisman that warmed under her skin. The flight to Italy was a blur of airless cabin lights and Donovan's quiet, the kind that said more than any orders. He didn't press questions the way some men did. He let her tell what she wanted, then filled in the places she left blank with facts. He spoke of old scores, with a tone that suggested inevitability rather than relish. "Bianca's family never forgave us for what happened between their grandfather and my man in Brooklyn," he said once. Eyes on the window where clouds made the world look like someone had washed a photograph too hard. Rossi and the family thought the Falcone ledger was their right. They believed it would buy them immunity. Sophia listened. Each sentence added color to a painting she had half understood. The ledger words, that felt like thunder now. Donovan told her less about the ledger than about the atmosphere around it. How men sat in rooms and stared at one another with the kind of hunger that had teeth. If it's real, he said, it's not paper alone. It's a debt collector's map. They arrived at Villa Scarpia 48 hours later, a white thing on a blue coast that smelled of lemon and salt. The villa was old in a way that made even the present seem antique. It had a garden that refused neatness and shutters that clicked like arthritic jaws. Arthur moved through its rooms with a kind of reverence. He treated corners like pages worth turning. Sophia felt the air here as if she were inhaling a different language. The journal she carried thin, leather-bound, found in a drawer in a priest's house. Donovan kept on retainer trembled heavy in her bag like something that remembered a man's hands. Sicily wasn't the theater of roaring gun battles the way Chicago had been in buried stories. It was quieter. The danger here, war, sun, and wind. At night the sea smelled of fish and distance and old faiths. In the daytime, Cicerolist conversations rolled like wells. Donovan walked the terraces with her. He watched the way her fingers curled around the journal and the way she read the handwriting as if it were a map. They spent mornings on the veranda, eating figs and talking the way survivors learned to speak careful sentences that left space for silence. On the second day, the journal yielded more than soot and prayer. It contained letters in a looping hand, lists, and an entry that stopped mid-sentence, the way a man will stop writing when he believes someone might read. The iron key Donovan found in a tin matchbox came with a note in a child's handwriting. For Soph, keep, love, J. The name sat next to Falcone like a footprint beside a river. The journal moved them. It said, in phrases that folded memory into fact, that Johnny Falcone had taken the ledger years before and hidden it from an industry of men who banked in secrets. He had spread its pieces across ledgers, bankrolled orphan accounts, and left marginal notes that might look like nonsense to a casual eye. Names written beside dates, initials in the margins, a small bird doodled in the corners. The journal did not say where the ledger lived. It gave attachments, instead an iron key, a half-riddle, a reference to an old church vault where stones remember what men pretend not to. It smells like protection, Arthur said, his voice a punctuation. He had been the sort to see patterns in ink, not hidden for greed, hidden to stop one man from destroying another. Sophia read the line that said, "Ledger is a ledger because men insist on keeping score." She felt something like fury and clarity at once. Her father had hidden an accusation inside a prayer. He had, it seemed, traded ledger pages for breathing room. They moved at dusk to the harbor, thinking artifacts and ledger clues might be one step removed from the city's reach. The marina wore its wealth like a shrug. Small boats, varnished wood, ropes that told their own stories of tides. The plan was simple in its audacity. Recover whatever Falcone had left and leave before anyone realized they had been there. Plans are paper. Fate is wind. The attack came like a cut in the evening. Men in dark jackets moved across the docks with the confidence of people who had been given permission to take things. They didn't bother to hide. Someone at the marina had been paid to look the other way. A speedboat cut through the water like a violent punctuation, and the world narrowed to shouts, the slap of canvas, the taste of salt on Sophia's tongue. She and Donovan moved like a pair, translating violence into steps. Stay low, stay close, hit where it hurts. Their movements threaded together, he guarded. She reached hand for a flicker of time, they were choreography. Then it broke. Donovan pushed her toward a narrow alley that smelled of diesel and old lemon peel. He told her to run. He pushed salvation away with the kind of simple ferocity that makes a person feel small and grateful at the same time. She hesitated only because hesitation had been something she had trained herself to avoid. He kissed her on the mouth, not soft, but not a thing of ownership either, a promise to return, raw and simple. "Go," he said. He stood in the open, like a man who'd stepped in front of a train and was ready to be demolished. Men grabbed him, tumbled him, hauled him into a van that smelled like stale oil and fear. Sophia had time for one thing before the van's door slammed. She pressed her thumb to her palm and tapped twice against a rusted railing, an old motion sent into the world to make a promise. The sound of it was small as a match. She remembered the weight of that gesture like a coin in her pocket. It was a signal and a farewell. By the time she got to her feet, the men were driving away with Donovan inside. He didn't look back. He reached through the open door and gave her a look rawer than any speech he'd ever made angry. Pleading, steady, he had been taken. The sea swallowed the van's taillights and left her in the echo. She did not crumble. There is a moment, cleaving in a life, when someone steps over the threshold where fear meets decision and decides which side of the door they'll live on. Sophia felt that door under her feet and she pushed. The next 48 hours were a fever of movement. Arthur and Silvio worked like people who understood that a missing man is an invitation for violence. They consulted with contacts, friends of Donovan's or men he'd once favored with quiet desperation. The syndicate was a beast with teeth. When you took away one bite, it snarled. Donovan's capture was more than personal. It was a claim, a calling card, a declaration that someone would press advantage. Back in Chicago, the news moved in surges. Bianca's absence during the harbor attack became a rumor turned into accusation. The Rossi family had been seen talking to men who kept their heads low. Arthur found the slim link they'd needed. A ledger entry, almost a billing note, that suggested Bianca had tipped a hand to a courier with instructions about who to watch. It wasn't explicit evidence in a court of law. It was a sequence of gestures that added up. Sophia was not content to wait. She moved with a focus that had not been hers before. The character of her decisions had changed. She no longer folded herself into survival's smaller needs. She went to a man in Trastevere, who had once run errands for her father, a small-time fixer with a cigarette burn on his thumb, and a conscience she suspected was for sale. He told her, for a price and with the chronic reluctance of one who knows the cost of loyalty, where Donovan had been taken. He said the syndicate used a safe house outside the city, a place where men thought law could not reach them because they had paid the right prices long ago. She did not go alone. Arthur and Silvio insisted, and she let them because the truth was simple. She needed people whose hands had been in this world longer than her own. Together they moved like a pack-quiet at first, then sharp as teeth. They reclaimed their friend with a brutality that had rules. Donovan was kept in a basement room painted a color that made the air feel thin. He was not broken. They had not wanted the satisfaction of finishing things. They wanted leverage. He was bruised and smelled of cigarettes and salt. He reached for Sophia's hand when she entered, and his fingers found hers like a practiced thing. He smiled in a way that tried to hide pain. "You're reckless," he said. "And you were dumber than the men who took you," she answered. They did not have a long reunion. There were pieces to move, and the world had the impatience of a man with many creditors. Donovan's first words in private were strategy, not the sentimental apologies movies favor. "They took me because they thought they'd get the ledger," he said. "They wanted to trade me for pages." "Pages they don't have?" she said. "Because the ledger isn't where they think." He looked at her as if she had been lit on fire and then cooled into something else. "Where is it?" She could have told him then in the torrent of relief, in the shelter of his arms, but she didn't. The ledger had to remain leverage. You do not wave the atom of your negotiation away the second someone meets you with bruises. Sophia understood leverage now, the way an accountant understands the tilt of a balance sheet. She had paper and people and a photograph and the memory of a lullaby. She wasn't just armoring back. She was The boardroom showdown could not be a fever dream. It had to be a slow, carefully administered cut. They could not simply burst into a room and shout. The syndicate was an organism with many arteries. To remove its head they had to show it wasn't immortal. In the days that followed, Sophia hardened into something deliberate. People who had once called her waitress now hesitated when the word entered their mouths. She learned to measure silence as precisely as script. Arthur's contacts acquired a copy of the ledger's index, nothing forensic or procedural, nothing that taught someone how to loot a bank but names, dates, the shape of transactions that suggested favors and bribes, the rough bones of evidence that would make men in suits look like children if placed under public light. She did not show the whole book. She didn't need to. The knowledge that such pages existed and that she had access to them was enough to make a room smell different. Donovan, still counting the cost of his wounds, moved slower. He watched her grow the way a father watches a child cross the street, the worry outpacing the pride. He taught her how to read a room. He taught her how to watch a hand foretells. He did so without condescension. The two of them, once rescuer and rescued, began, in small, dangerous increments, to become co-conspirators. There was a plan. Take the ledger index to the public and to the families who mattered. Threaten exposure in a way that would make bloodless men flinch. She would book a place at the Concaid boardroom Midinga, place the syndicate used every month to settle accounts that required more ritual than law. She would go there, not with a gun, but with photos, with citations, with the ledger's index, and with Arthur's calm and Silvio's muscle presented as restraint. The spectacle had to be surgical. Show the ledger existed. Show that she had the will to make it speak. Bianca, for all her veiled charm, had always underestimated Sophia's ability to move like a shadow. She thought a girl who'd worked a diner could be bullied into silence. She had misread the way hunger can teach cunning. The night before the confrontation, they prepared like a group going to confession. Sophia dressed in black that did not scream for attention. The wardrobe was a decision born of Donovan's insistence that people notice the eyes before the suit. Arthur carried the index in a portfolio so heavy it made his walk a statement. Silvio walked with a folded newspaper over his hand, as if reading was a courtesy. On the morning of the board meeting, the city felt like a thing that had been steeled into place. The Concaid building, with its glass that reflected the sky in slices, seemed to expect storms. Guests aged like fruit. Victoria Russo arrived in a gown that suggested a coin made flesh, cold, ornate, and perfectly measured. Her smile was a threat wrapped in lace. Sophia walked into the room like someone who had finally understood the grammar of power. She placed the portfolio on the table like a present and then opened it. Photographs, spilled out faces, dates, signatures, a map that implied collusion between aldermen and shipping brokers, names that read like a list of favors. She didn't shout. She let the paper speak. The room shifted. Men who had been mountains hit knees. Bianca's face did not change much. She looked like someone used to editing out emotions. "You threaten families with paper?" she said. "I have paper," Sophia answered, "and I have witnesses, and I have a ledger index that proves the ledger exists and where its last agreements took place." Victoria's laugh was like a shard of glass. "You, child, think a book can topple us?" A long, calculated silence. Then Arthur leaned forward and said, in the voice of a man who understood the slow work of coalitions, "We can make a public record of this. We can present these papers to offices that don't take kindly to private wars." That was the lever. The room stilled. It was then that Sophia made the decision that would be the fulcrum of the moment. She lifted her hand and, for the second time in the day, pressed her thumb into her palm and tapped twice soft, almost convent, like a prayer. It was the same signal she had sent at the diner, the same movement that had called Donovan across chrome tables. In the boardroom, it became a command. On the roof, a single shot answered. No one in the room had time to scream. The bullet, the sound like a broken cord, blew through Victoria's shoulder as if to puncture his hubris. She hit the table like a small animal felled by a storm. Her attendants rushed. Bianca's face went slack and then, hardest, the room turned into a machine that functioned on old warnings. Evacuate. Shield. Call for backup. Sophia did not weep. She did not clap. She sat as if the air around her was a thing she measured and could place a hand upon. Arthur rose, took a folder, and slid it toward the center of the table. "The ledger index is evidence of intent," he said. "Not rumor. Not hearsay." Bianca's voice was a fine blade. "You had him killed." "I applied pressure," Sophia said. "You chose the response. You chose the hand." A man from Donovan's network, who had been on the roof someone. Sophia had bought with favors, and Arthur's promise had acted at her signal. They did not discuss bargains at that moment. They moved with choreography. They'd rehearsed with desperate hands. The shot fractured a room built on the illusion of survival. In the chaos, men scrambled for phones, for legal counsel, for old alliances. Donovan's Mendo's loyal in a way that wasn't sentimental move to seize the room's soft core. Its documents, its communications, its ability to be used against them. Sophia reached across the table and picked up the portfolio. She felt the paper, as if it were a living thing. It had teeth. They freed Donovan that day. Bianca, reeling, tried to bargain in the only currency she understood. Humiliation. She accused, she flung insinuations, she called old favors. But the ledger existed now in more than rumor. There were witnesses, photos, a roof shot that had made the room bleed. People who had been inclined to side with Bianca felt the air shift away from them. Men who had feared being exposed were suddenly more wary of retaliation than they were of revenge. Donovan, when he stood, was not the man he had been, but he was very much a man still. His shoulder ached. His jaw bore a shadow of bruises. He looked at Sophia, and in his eyes was both gratitude and a new, careful fear. "You pushed where I couldn't push," he said. "You were taken," she answered. "You did not stop me from saving you." He smiled, small and private. "You used the signal. You used what I taught you." "It saved you," she said. "It almost cost me my life," he corrected. "But it saved me, too." Outside, news crawlers were already eating the edge of the event. The syndicate's public face cracked, and in the fractures men who had been comfortable in the comfort of old deals now tasted the strange sourness of uncertainty. Some left town. Some made quiet, expensive calls. A few chose to bargain with Sophia. She did not seek to become a criminal queen for clank. She wanted to reorder a dangerous ledger into something less lethal. She used the index like insurance. Names placed on the table. A map that made the cost of retribution a ledger entry they could not erase. In return for peace, she asked for Donovan's safety, for the recall of old debts that had corrupted neighborhoods, and for protections for people who had no voice in the old system. It was a bargain that was moral in its spine but precarious in its flesh. She forced the syndicate into a public reckoning that left more wounds than she had planned for. That was the cost. Bianca was removed from the inner councils. Rossi, exposed as an intermediary who'd traded codes, was stripped of favor and exiled. Her family's influence clipped in a way that left a fine, permanent bitterness. Victoria Russo was gone from the boardroom's center, first wounded, then alive enough to face indictment papers that arrived, it seemed, by the day. They didn't execute her. There were consequences, and also limits to what Sophia would become. She had no wish to be monstrous. She wanted order. When the dust settled, Sophia stood with Donovan and Arthur and Silvio in a room of glass that looked over a city that smelled like rain and old money. Donovan, bruised and complicated, put his hand on her shoulder the way someone might steady a chart. He said, lightly, "Coffee, booth, 4. Black, plain." She laughed, then a brief, clean sound that made the room feel younger. "Will you drink it like a man who has been shot at?" "Maybe," he said. "Maybe I will sip it like someone who has a reason to come back." They didn't speak of the ledger as a throne. They spoke of it as responsibility. Sophia understood more than ever that power had teeth, and that those teeth always wanted more. She would have to bargain, to refuse, to give and take. She had wanted, once, the small safety of a life measured in orders and plates. Now she carried a ledger's shadow in her pocket. It wasn't all triumph. There were funerals for men who'd been collateral. There were protests and old friends who could not forgive her for what she'd done. She lost people to choices that were not hers to unmake. She kept a photo of her father's laugh folded in her wallet and sometimes, late at night, thumbed its edge. She thought of Johnny Falcone and of what it meant to hide truth for the sake of protecting someone you loved. Months passed. The Concaid syndicate fractured into smaller cells. Some made peace, some made war, and some disappeared into quieter pursuits. Donovan's name remained in the ledger as a man you'd pay attention to. Sophia's name began to appear in places it had never been before, whispered in the corridors of power, over cigarette smoke, in the jokes of men who were trying to measure where she stood. They called her many things: a queen, a usurper, a reckoning. She preferred, privately, the word keeper. She kept her rituals. She still tied her hair back with the same elastic and still wiped tables with the same sure motion. She still visited the diner sometimes at sunrise before the world had learned to whisper her name. The people in the booth remembered her as the girl who'd saved a man in a wool coat. They did not know the ledger. They did not need to. They only knew that the girl who served eggs sometimes sat with a man who ordered black coffee and left cups half full. One day, months after the boardroom, Donovan walked into the diner under a sky that promised rain. He looked older by a handful of days and a million small decisions. He sat in booth 4 and ordered the black coffee. He stirred the cup once and then let the spoon rest. He watched her across the room, and the look they shared was the kind that had been forged in steel and salt. It was tender and dangerous and entirely without pretense. "Booth 4?" he asked when she came over. She pulled the chair out and sat opposite him, like they had a right to small rituals now. "You asked for it," she said. "You wanted it plain." He smiled. "I want it plain, because I like it simple. Because I want the little things that are not ledgers and not stairs to climb." She watched him drink. Slow. He lifted the cup, and for a moment they were not boss and ward or conspirators in a violent harvest. They were simply two people who had been through something and wanted a coffee to make the world momentarily less loud. Outside, a bus hissed by and someone laughed, a wild laugh. Inside, the coffee tasted like a life reclaimed. Sophia touched her palm, the memory of the thumb tucked like a talisman catching dust. She put it over the table and tapped twice soft, private, the same signal that had saved a life, started a war, and reshaped an underworld. Donovan watched her and smiled in a way that made the corners of his mouth honest. The gesture was not a command now. It was recognition. What followed will astound you, she thought later, in a way that made the phrase private. It wasn't just the violence or the ledger or the politics. It was the way a small thing Tuta said rippled outward and left a map on the world. She had started as someone who served coffee and ended as someone who held a city's grudges like a ledger. The world had changed her. She had, in turn, changed the world. They left the diner together, not as conquerors, but as people who had learned to wear power like a coat careful of its seams, aware of where it might fray. In the alley behind the diner, Sophia paused and pressed the photograph to her chest. She thought of her father and of the iron key and of the lullaby that had written a map across her bones. She thought of the ledger that had seemed to be only paper and had turned out to be a kind of pulse. Donovan slipped his hand into hers, not possessing, but anchoring. "Coffee tomorrow?" he asked. "Booth 4, she said. "Black." They walked into the rain like two people moving through a world that now bowed when they passed. Behind them, the city continued to spin, gritty, old, and stubborn. It would have more stories, and no doubt, more violence. Power rarely sleeps. But for now, a waitress and a mob boss had rewritten a small arc of its story. And in the quiet after, they had found the small pleasure of a cup of coffee and the knowledge that a silent signal could change everything.